Dear Anna,
A key handed to me by an unfamiliar woman. Inside an unknown apartment was a single envelope addressed to me. As I read the letter penned in my husband George's distinctive handwriting, the world before me blurred. In that empty room, I cried aloud for the first time since George passed away. I am Anna, a 40-year-old part-time homemaker. Balancing work at a pharmacy, housework, and raising kids keeps me constantly on the move. We have 2 children, our son and daughter. Our son, Bill, started elementary school this year. He's a spirited soccer kid, small for his age, but brave enough to take on older boys. Our daughter, Elizabeth, is in preschool and a bit of a clingy sweetheart, often shedding tears at drop-off. However, she has a kind heart and loves looking after younger kids. My husband George, the father of our children, was my classmate in college. He had a gentle nature, avoiding conflict, and always watching over me and the kids warmly. But there were people who deeply scarred George's kind heart. Those people were George's own parents and sister. One weekday evening, as we were finishing dinner and preparing the kids for bed, George's mother, Barbara, and sister, Abigail, barged in unannounced.
Hey, George. There's a concert for my favorite artist in Houston next week. You'll drive me, right?
Abigail barked her command without so much as a greeting. George sighed heavily.
I can't. Bill has a soccer match that weekend.
Just let Anna handle it. Soccer matches happen all the time, but I can't see my favorite artist just any day, you know?
That's not the point. Why don't you just take the train?
George, you're so mean.
Abigail whined, feigning tears. Seeing her daughter's crocodile tears, Barbara turned to George with a face like thunder.
George, you're her older brother. Treat her with care. Abigail is sensitive.
Abigail burst into a boo-hoo.
Ugh.
George sighed again, clearly exhausted. I was utterly appalled by this 38-year-old woman's childish tantrum. Just then, Bill, who should have been asleep in his room, appeared and tugged on George's shirt.
It's okay, Dad. Mom can take me.
Bill, you don't have to.
Oh my sweet nephew. See? He's fine with it, so you better promise to drive me, George. If you break it, I'll curse you.
Hey,
Ignoring George's protests, Barbara and Abigail imposed their plans and left without a care.
I'm so sorry, Annabelle.
I couldn't bring myself to complain as George slumped his shoulders in defeat. George once told me that his parents had always poured all their love into Abigail while giving him only the bare minimum of care. Naturally, Abigail grew up spoiled, unable to maintain friendships or hold a job. She's been living off her parents, unemployed, for years. But as George's parents aged, their health and finances could no longer accommodate Abigail's demands. 3 years ago, they moved near our house, hoping to rely on George. Having grown up neglected, George was initially thrilled to be needed and blindly catered to their every whim. But I worked hard to deprogram him, making him realize they were just using him. Even so, the wounds George carried from growing up without love ran deep, and it seemed he couldn't completely give up on receiving his parents' affection. It seemed he just couldn't bring himself to firmly push them away. It was heartbreaking to watch George struggle, and the situation brought nothing but trouble to me and our kids. For the sake of our family's peace, I was determined to help George break free from his toxic relatives, no matter how long it took. But I came to regret not acting sooner. One day, George started complaining about back pain. A visit to the doctor led to a referral to a larger hospital where a devastating diagnosis awaited. The doctor told us George had a severe illness and only 6 months to live. The disease had progressed silently, with no symptoms until it was too late. Being just 40, George's condition was advancing rapidly. The shock was so overwhelming that I don't even remember how I got home from the hospital that day. For a week, I scoured the internet for hope, reading countless blogs about people battling similar illnesses, but none of them offered the ending I so desperately wanted. All the while, George's condition worsened. I didn't want to accept it, but I had no choice. I took leave from work and threw myself into caring for George and our children. We seized every opportunity to go out, dine at his favorite restaurants, and travel while he still had the strength. George repeatedly thanked me and apologized, even helping with chores when he felt up to it. The kids, in their own way, understood their dad's illness and did their best to cheer him on. And yet, his family remained as awful as ever. When we told them about George's diagnosis, Abigail grimaced and said,
Wait, is this genetic? I'm not at risk, am I?
She was only concerned about herself. Her parents panicked, exclaiming, "Oh no, what if Abigail gets sick too?" They forcibly pleaded with George's doctor to squeeze in a medical test for Abigail. This left not only me, but also George's doctor completely appalled. And when it was confirmed that Abigail had no issues, they immediately shifted to money, saying, "How much is this treatment going to cost? Don't expect us to lend you anything." George's family didn't say a single word of concern for him or show any sadness. Seeing their behavior, the already pale George seemed to lose even more vitality. Not wanting to watch him suffer any further, I did my best to shield him.
I'm sorry, Anna. Even though they're my parents, I'm leaving everything to you.
George, looking apologetic, hung his head low. I grasped his hand tightly. "It's okay. I can handle it if it means you can stay strong. Because you're my family, and you're so important to me." Hearing my words, George's face lifted with a start.
You're right. We're family.
He repeated my words, then fell silent, as if deep in thought. After that, despite repeated hospital stays, George tried his best to live fully. But 10 months after his prognosis, he passed away. Holding my sobbing children, I had no time to cry myself as I prepared for the funeral. When I notified George's family, their only response was, "Oh, I see." They didn't come to the hospital, and George was taken to the funeral home without ever seeing his parents again. It was too cruel, considering they'd just lost their own son. Just imagining how George must have felt brought tears to my eyes. In the end, we held the wake without any support from his family. Many of George's co-workers and friends attended. Everyone, with tears in their eyes, offered us their condolences and words of encouragement. As most of the attendees gathered, and the staff began preparing to start the service, his parents, Chris and Barbara, along with his sister Abigail, finally arrived. They handed nothing to the reception, ignored me, the chief mourner, and rushed straight to George's casket.
George, how could this happen?
He was only 40, just 40 years old.
George, don't leave me behind.
The three of them, fully grown adults, wailed and clung to the casket. Some elderly attendees, moved by their display, wiped away their own tears. Perhaps losing a son at such a young age might excuse their behavior, but knowing how they treated George during his life, I felt nothing but anger. They didn't even come to the hospital, and now... The words slipped out before I could stop myself, and Barbara's head whipped around to glare at me.
This is your fault. If you had taken better care of George's health.
Exactly. You're a worthless wife who couldn't even look after George properly.
I knew I didn't deserve such accusations from them, but their cruel words pierced my heart. I had blamed myself countless times. If only I had noticed sooner, maybe George could have been saved. As my throat tightened and I struggled to speak, Bill shouted loudly to defend me.
Mom's not at fault. Dad and the doctor both said so. Mom worked so hard for us, for Dad and for us.
Oh, so she even fooled the doctor? She's the worst wife ever.
You didn't even visit Dad at the hospital once, Grandpa, Grandma, and Abigail.
That's impossible. We're family. Because you didn't go to hospital, we didn't see each other. We visited every day and held his hand.
Liar.
Abigail's blatant lie made Bill glare at her, breathing heavily in anger. Our ugly argument caused murmurs throughout the room. I knew they hadn't visited the hospital. There was no way they had shown him any kindness. But there was no way to prove it here and now.
Anna.
My father, Jeffy, who had been watching over Elizabeth, and my mother approached us, looking worried. They would undoubtedly take my side, and if the argument continued, George's family would likely expose themselves further. But if I kept fighting, George's final farewell would be ruined. George, with his gentle heart, would never have wanted that. I clenched my freezing hands until my nails dug into my palms. I need a moment to cool off. Summoning all my strength, I carried a fuming Bill out of the room. After calming the children, I returned to the family seating area. George's family sat there, looking down on us with triumphant expressions. It wasn't about winning or losing. I knew that, but I couldn't help feeling bitter. Throughout the wake and the funeral, George's family acted as if they were mourning him deeply, inserting themselves everywhere, as if it were their right. All I could do was wear a blank expression, hold my children's hands tightly, and bid farewell to George. A beautiful woman hesitantly approached me, who was lost in a haze.
My name is Jamie. I was George's colleague. I just am so sorry for your loss.
Oh, thank you, I replied, staring at her blankly as she offered her condolences. After glancing around to ensure no one was watching, Jamie pulled out a letter from her bag and pressed it into my hand.
This is from George. Please read it when you're alone.
What? She left without saying more. I stood there dumbfounded. Though I found her actions suspicious, I tucked the letter into my bag. Later, while waiting for the cremation, I stepped away from George's parents, who were eagerly discussing how to use his inheritance, and entrusted the kids to my parents. Alone in the restroom, I carefully opened the letter. Inside, written in George's distinct handwriting, was the address of an unfamiliar apartment and the instruction, "Keep this a secret from my parents." Alongside the letter was a silver key. After the funeral, my parents offered to stay at my place for a while. Grateful for their help, I focused on sorting through George's belongings and dismantling the hospital bed we'd set up for him. Every item I touched brought back memories, making my chest ache. Even during this time, George's parents kept calling, demanding, "Hand over the inheritance." The weight of my grief made me feel like giving up on everything. For a moment, I even considered handing over the money just to make them stop. Even so, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter and key Jamie had given me, so I left the children with my parents and headed to the address written in the letter. It led to a condominium in a newly developed area of a city near where my parents lived. When I inserted the key into the designated apartment door, it opened effortlessly, revealing a beautifully renovated 3-bedroom unit. The spacious room was empty, devoid of furniture or appliances. The only item inside was a brown envelope placed on the built-in kitchen counter. Inside the envelope were a lawyer's business card and 3 sheets of letter paper. The letter, written in George's slightly peculiar handwriting, was filled with apologies and words of gratitude.
I'm sorry for all the pain my parents and sister caused you. The previous owner of this apartment was a friend of mine. I sold all the stocks had been quietly building up since before we got married to buy it. If you don't like it, feel free to sell it for cash. But please, leave that apartment and get away from my parents. Jamie's husband is a lawyer, and I entrusted him with my will. The view of the jacaranda from the living room window is beautiful. I hope you and the kids will like it. Thank you for giving me a family. Marrying you, Anna, made me truly happy.
When I looked up from the letter, I saw a row of jacaranda trees in full bloom through the curtainless window. Their petals, just past their peak, scattered in the wind. George. My voice echoed through the empty room. Of course, there was no reply. For the first time since George's death, I cried out loud. When I returned to the apartment with swollen eyes, I found my parents and George's parents arguing outside the door. The moment George's parents noticed me, they began shouting,
Hey, give us George's inheritance. It's been 2 weeks since the funeral.
Don't tell me you've already spent it.
You too.
My parents, red-faced and trembling with anger, were outraged by the disgusting accusations from George's parents. I clutched the envelope in my hand tightly and looked George's parents straight in the eye. There's no inheritance for you. When I firmly refused, my in-laws' eyes widened in shock.
What? Are you planning to keep it all for yourself?
I will split it between myself and the children.
We're his parents. You're just some unrelated outsider. Don't you think this is unfair?
It's not a matter of fairness. The law states that when a married man with a family passes away, his inheritance goes to his wife and children. You won't receive a single cent.
Well,
George's parents bit their lips. They probably already knew they had no legal right to the inheritance. That's why they tried to paint me as the villain during the funeral, and why they were now barging in to wear me down and take the money. Even now, Chris continued to hurl ugly words at me, hoping to break my resolve.
You greedy woman. George died because you mistreated him for his inheritance. You're a wicked wife. A devil.
I don't need to hear that from you. At my roar, George's parents flinched for a moment. I glared at them with all the hatred I could muster. Then I spoke each word as if casting a curse. I will never forgive you for treating George like an object and neglecting him. Even now, you continue to desecrate him. I don't care if George forgives you. I never will.
eek.
Barbara let out a small scream at my expression and words. Chris, though shaken, still tried to glare at me defiantly.
You little brat. I'll sue you. I'll prove you killed George and make sure I get that money back.
Go ahead, I'll face you anytime. I had absolutely no intention of handing over anything George left behind to those people. A few days later, George's parents showed up with someone claiming to be a lawyer, and what they insisted was George's will. I also called Jamie's husband, who is an actual lawyer, to join us. The will George's parents presented was filled with nonsense, stating that I had poisoned him and that all his inheritance should go to his parents.
How tragic for poor George.
Barbara sobbed loudly while Chris nodded repeatedly beside her. In response, my lawyer pulled out the real will. It clearly detailed the inheritance and included the line, "All inheritance goes to Anna, Bill, and Elizabeth. Nothing will be given to my parents or Abigail." Since this was an official notarized will, there was no way George's parents could challenge it. They never imagined that the obedient George would leave a will specifically to reject them. The utterly stunned look on their faces is something I will never forget. Barbara's face turned pale as her lips trembled.
This must be a lie. Sweet, gentle George would never do something so cruel.
The one who turned kind George into this was you. Barbara's eyes widened at my words. Perhaps, at long last, she realized her mistakes. How foolish. Chris, still oblivious, mumbled to himself. Smiling brightly, my lawyer addressed them.
Now then, forging a will and impersonating a lawyer are both crimes. Are you prepared to face the consequences?
The color drained from both George's parents and the so-called lawyers' faces. In the end, their forgery and the fake lawyer didn't lead to severe charges. Using the chaos to my advantage, I moved with the kids to the condo George had prepared for us. By the time George's parents realized, our apartment was completely empty. Of course, I didn't tell them our destination, and since they never cared about me, they didn't even know where my parents lived. Apparently, George's parents and Abigail had been overspending, relying on George's inheritance, even while he was alive. When they realized the money was gone, they panicked. Desperate, the three of them searched for me relentlessly. There, Chris spotted a woman at the station who resembled me from behind and flew into a rage. He tried to push her down the stairs, but ended up accidentally falling himself, suffering severe injuries. Chris screamed. The daughter-in-law did it, causing the police to contact me. Of course, I was innocent. Around the same time, Barbara collapsed from a heart condition. She shouted, "The daughter-in-law poisoned me," at the hospital, leading to yet another call from the police. Again, I was proven innocent. With their parents gone, Abigail, now struggling to survive, resorted to shoplifting. She listed me as her guarantor, but I firmly responded, "Am not related to her." At this rate, it wouldn't be long before their dire circumstances led the local government to contact me for support. To avoid this, I filed for the dissolution of my marriage to George. It saddened me to sever the legal bond, but the love and memories we shared as a couple would never disappear. Even if the law no longer recognized it, as long as I believed George was my family, I knew he'd be smiling down at us. And so, I watched as George's toxic family spiraled into ruin and started a new life with my children in the condo George had left for us. 3 years later, I now work full-time at a local pharmacy and live peacefully with my kids, who are now in elementary school. Though I've grown accustomed to life without George, moments of loneliness still creep up unexpectedly. A year ago, a new family member joined us. It was a tabby kitten with golden eyes, whom Bill found abandoned in the condo's parking lot. We named her Moran, and she became part of our family after Bill brought her home.
Maran, dinner time.
Meow. Marin, let's sleep together. Meow.
Every time we call her name, Moran responds and rubs against our legs, melting all our hearts. Moran seems to be a pacifist, disliking conflict. Whenever the kids and I argue, she appears out of nowhere and gently presses her paw against our mouths. It's as if she's saying, "No fighting." With such gestures, we can't help but smile. And we forget whatever we were arguing about.
She doesn't like fighting, just like Dad.
Elizabeth said, her cheeks softening into a smile.
Maybe she's Dad's reincarnation?
Bill joked, half serious. I don't believe much in reincarnation, and even if it were real, it seems too soon. But I've heard stories of beloved pets returning to their grieving owners in new forms. If George came back to us disguised as a cat, I can almost imagine him struggling to fit into a cat costume. The thought made me burst out laughing. Reincarnation or not, George will always be the most beloved dad in the world to us, and Moran will always be a cherished part of our family. I'll treasure the peaceful life and the family George left behind for us.
See you later.
See you later.
At 7 a.m. on a weekday morning, the kids dashed out, busy getting ready for school, as they called out to George's photo on their way out the door. See you later. I also spoke to George, smiling in his photo, as I opened the door. By the window with its beautiful view of Jacaranda, Moran was curled up. She let out a gentle meow.